I'm going to stand up because it's kind of hard to sit in this position and talk. My history comes from Charleston, where I grew up. We had a bunch of Mothman sightings, and it did involve 911 in that I had a friend who was seeing Mothman, and he claimed that there was going to be this terrorist event in 2001, and that I could see it. Mothman would let me see it if we stood in this particular spot in his yard. So we stood there and held hands, and I saw this 2 or 3 second vision of exploding buildings, which scared me enough that I stopped being friends with him. And then when 911 happened, I realized that he actually was onto something, and that Mothman was kind of a real thing, and maybe the prophecies the Mothman had been giving people were real. So that's when I started filming Mothman's Photographer, which is about 10 years old now. We've been doing interviews for 10 years. We've got 50 plus witnesses, John Keel, people like that, talking about Mothman. And got some new episodes actually here in the last couple of years. And I've got a few of those at the table, and that may be I don't know how many more of those we're going to do, but if you're interested in investigating some of the other sightings in the area, not just the Point Pleasant ones, although we do have a bunch of Point Pleasant people in there too, that would be a disc to check out. Yeah, I don't know how far to go into that. Oh, well, what happened the last couple of years is 2 or 3 people that lived on Woodward Drive, which is where I lived in North Charleston, sort of the Dunbar area, have come forward to say that they had seen Mothman. And these are people I knew back then, and I trust them, but they just didn't want to ever talk about what they had seen because they didn't want to be laughed at or called a nut or whatever. And one guy who was here last year when I gave my talk, Mothman touched him on the shoulder, and I didn't really put it all together until now, but he actually came to my house one day, right after I had seen Mothman, this is in the early 70s. He came to visit. Mothman had recently touched him on the shoulder. My sister was there. She took a picture of me, and in the window is his face that looks like a Garuda or a Thunderbird. And it was accidentally found by my 2-year-old son, who pointed to the face and said Garuda. Otherwise, we never would have seen it. So that got me going on that trail, but it sort of looks like, this lady contacted me last year and said, I was with your sister in the woods and we saw the red eyes, and it was invisible. The body was invisible, but it was the red eyes, and she thought it was Mothman because her brother had seen Mothman in the Birdman form in that same place soon after that. So, but my sister never even mentioned it. So everybody in that was involved in that photo and was in the room at the time had seen Mothman, but my sister had just, I don't know why she never told anyone. I just found out that she had seen him through someone else. So that's a new development that's pretty interesting. And that area that we all saw Mothman in is called Bird Mountain. So and I just met a guy at my table who knows that area, and he knows Bird Mountain and everything, and I told him about the church and the school that was there, the old school that burned down, which may have stimulated Mothman to show up there, because it could have been Charles Manson who burned the school down, because Charles Manson lived on our street. And that may explain, Manson ties into that whole weird ex-Nazi thing too. He has a swastika right on his forehead. And he was probably programmed by the same guys that were programming some of the UFO abductees. What else have I got on my list here? Recent stuff. I'm going to keep it short because we're running behind, and I don't want the person coming after me to be delayed too much. That's the main stuff I want to talk about right now. Let's go to questions if anybody. Does that sound all right? What time is it? How much time we got? 10 minutes, all right. Questions? If any of the stuff that I've said freak you out too much, to ask a question about it. Where's Chris? He always asks a question about Aleister Crowley. Oh yeah, all the major UFO contactees. He's asking about Stephen Greer came forward and said that they were faking the abductions. Is that what you? Yeah, it's a terror program, just like a lot of the things that we're told all the time to scare us. And you know, I could go into why that is, but you know, it's kind of outside of what we're doing today. But yeah, Greer's an interesting guy. He's told the truth about certain things, and the cancer stuff. You know, he was talking about being, you know, they were taking people out with cancer, which I think is definitely part of it. The Men in Black, I think, were doing that. They were killing people with cancer so no one could find out. And that may have been what happened to my father. So that's how I, you know, one of the reasons I got into the conspiracy stuff was trying to find out what was that all about. Was he really killed with cancer? Because it's a freaky idea. But the Russians are, you know, and the Russians may have been involved. It may not have been our government that did it. Because if, you know, my dad worked for Carbide and brought in a secret part of what they were doing. You know, in fact, a lot of the UFO pieces that they found, Keel writes about this in these old magazine articles. It doesn't appear in the Mothman Prophecies. You have to go to these old articles to find it, but a lot of the different tubes that they would find at UFO sites, you know, were stuff that Carbide made, and DuPont also. You know, DuPont has a plant near Charleston where they were seeing men catch on fire and disappear. I worked there for a while, and I heard all those stories, and I think, you know, that's what happened to the Philadelphia experiment guys. So, my dad was a Philadelphia experiment veteran, so I think they were sending those guys here to keep a better eye on them, because it's more isolated and stuff. And, you know, maybe they were being hit with lasers that they were testing or something, because they were testing lasers at the time. Maybe it wasn't aliens at all. But I agree with you that there's a lot of cooked stories, especially the famous ones, the ones that they like to focus on all the time. Even Roswell, you know, had carbide glue found at the scene not too long ago. They actually dug down into the ground and isolated the glue that was being used as some kind of adhesive. And then, you know, everybody just, you know, you mentioned carbide and everybody just, their head just goes empty. They're like, carbide doesn't exist anymore, but it does. It's still around. And Michelle Obama worked for Carbide. She didn't work for Carbide, but she was a lawyer for Carbide when their Bhopal plant blew up. So that may, you know, Carbide's got a lot more power than you think through the people that own the company and the people that own Olin, obviously Rockefellers and people like that. So it's something to keep an eye on. Any other questions? I hate to burst the ET bubble, because I know that, you know, it's very exciting to think that we're being visited from outer space.
Do you think most of it, like things that people are experiencing are caused by, you know, like a certain form of government, or black government that's hidden? Or do you think there is actually some legitimate, like paranormal or mystical things that people are experiencing?
Yeah, I do think there's legitimate paranormal stuff. You know, this thing where we saw 911 before it happened, that was real. I know that. So you can see into the future. I know that's real. I know you can see. I've seen a UFO that looks like it's changing shape, so I know that's real. I don't know. I still don't know if it's synthetic or not. Some of the old sightings from the old days appear to be real, but you know, because they're so old, you don't really know if the thing got reported correctly or if it was a hoax that got twisted out of shape. It's tough. It's tough to figure it out. So it's still there. That enigma of whether or not these things are man-made or not is still there. But I just think some of them are more obviously man-made, and you can tell by who's promoting it, when it happens, how much is promoted, the types of things that happen during the encounter. Like the Betty and Barney Hill case really started off with them seeing a Nazi, a guy in a Nazi uniform, but then it somehow, the army hypnotized them, and then they forgot all about the Nazi, and then it became gray aliens. And this guy that I was talking about earlier, this Los Alamos engineer, said that he had a whole timeline set up for how they started off with little green men in the late 40s, and they ended up with gray aliens. And they're both they're both the Nazi skull in a way. The gray alien face seems to be an adaptation of the Nazi skull, which is a very obscure image that the Nazis use, and not a lot of people are familiar with it. But when you say Nazis, you have to be careful, because after the war they were subsumed into all the other countries' war efforts, so they don't really exist anymore in that way. But the things that they believed in and the technologies they were working on were co-opted and are still being used to develop some of the amazing technology that we have. And some of the beliefs, probably the occult beliefs that they had, are still out there.
What do you mean by Garuda?
The Garuda is an ancient Hindu deity who and he's also a Buddhist deity. So if you see the Buddha, if you see paintings of the Buddha, you'll see the Buddha sitting on the throne, and then there'll be like a membrane above his head, sort of like the halo of Jesus, but spread out bigger. And then above it is the Garuda, and he sort of floats in the space. It's called the void. It's the area where magnetism exists. It doesn't really depend on light or photons. But it's the deeper organizing principle of the universe. And it's very mysterious. Magnetism is something that is not understood at all, barely today. I mean, they have some knowledge of it, but they're still trying to figure out what particles, if you break down a light, it's very difficult to locate where magnetism is in there. But it's in there somewhere. They know it's in there, they just can't identify it. So it's still outside of our awareness level. Can't really observe it scientifically and say much about it. But that's what the Garuda kind of represents, and he's a protector deity. Usually Vishnu rides on his back, and Vishnu is the preserver of worlds. So whenever you come upon a time when the world is under threat, existence, I think serious things like nuclear power, or maybe the 2012 magnetic shift or something, then you'll see the Garuda come in. You might have more sightings of Garuda, but he generally is thought of as a protector. He's going to, he's like the right-hand man of God, more or less. So he's not a demon, at least by their measure. So that's kind of why I think he was appearing here, and why Keel thought he might be a Garuda, is because some of these technologies that these guys were working on, if they had a Nazi bell weapon, for instance, in the TNT underground or something, which they power UFOs with somehow, this thing vibrates at such a high rate that it could have weakened buildings around, it could have weakened the Silver Bridge, it can affect human bodies in a very negative way, and it's tied in with nuclear power somehow too. So these are all things that the public needs to be more aware of, so that we can make sure that we don't keep going down this crazy road where, because if a plant blows up, it takes thousands of years for that stuff to go away. So and it really was kind of these Nazis who sort of came up with the idea to have nuclear power in the beginning. They invented it, more or less. And, why are we still, going down that road?